Our next speaker is Naresh Keerthi. Naresh is Assistant Professor of Sanskrit at Ashoka University. Formerly, he taught Sanskrit at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and the Chinmaya Vishwavidyapeeth at Kerala. He's conducted doctoral research on the semantics of color in Sanskrit at the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore. Naresh is interested in the kāvya and nāṭya literature of Sanskrit, Prakrit, and their mutual interactions with the literary cultures of South India. He studies topics at the intersection of the lexicon, grammar, and poetics, and is investigating the development of poetic topoi in kāvya literature. Naresh is also interested in the history of classical music and musicology in South India in the early modern period. He's currently working on a Sanskrit text on aesthetic emotions, the Bhāvaviveka by Divākara. May I invite Naresh? Yes.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you in this wonderful event to celebrate this wonderful individual called Bhogeshwar Rao, also known to some people as David Shulman. If I may share two things amongst countless others that I've seen and appreciated in David. The first one's a bit hard to describe because perhaps it's more than one thing, but let's call it radical openness. There's nothing he's not curious about. There's nothing he doesn't find value in. There's nothing he can't find an interesting idea in. And this kind of explains why he has a dozen hometowns, 24 mother tongues, and friends everywhere he goes. Yadum ure, yavarum kedir. These qualities of openness and endless curiosity also feed into a certain generosity of spirit, hospitality that I've seen and marveled and also cherished. David sees potentials and possibilities in stories, but also in students, and possibilities that others wouldn't or can't see. And he manages to extract amazing insights, both from texts and from persons. And if there's one thing I'd like to emulate from David, it's this quality, this radical hospitality. The second thing I've kind of really noticed is his love for a good story. He eats them up like a caterpillar, eating mulberry leaves only to spin out golden silk. And while we've had conversations on every kind of topic, serious and light, and conversations of every kind of length, a kind of golden thread running through most of our meetings is that we exchange an anecdote or a story. And these would usually be very interesting, they'd often be very funny, but they'd compulsorily take quite some time to tell in here. But this is a delight we both share. And I believe this ability to listen with attention and love to stories, to appreciate them, and to offer another story in return is perhaps the most basic, the most elemental way of doing the humanities. It's worth reminding ourselves about this feature of the humanities while we skirt about theory and turn all kinds of tricks based on the academic flavor of the month. I even have an expression for this kind of long excursus that tend to appear in our conversations. I call it to stretch a short story long. Why would you want to cut a long story short? Especially if it's David telling the story. So in this, my tribute to my teacher, friend, and student, David Shulman, I'll mostly be telling you a story. And in keeping with our sampradaya, I'll stretch the short story long, within the time allowed. The title of my talk is All the King's Horses. And you may guess from the title that the story I'm going to tell you is about a Humpty Dumpty. But it's no ordinary Humpty Dumpty. The protagonist of our story is a Vaishnava Humpty Dumpty. And he may even be from South India. And in this tale, his devotion and his sense of dharma, which includes radical hospitality, are put to test. My story is from a text called the Jaimini Bharata, or the Jaiminiya Ashwamedhika Parva. This is a much beloved collection of stories that spins off from the Mahabharata epic It circulated a great deal all over the subcontinent ever since the oldest Sanskrit version was written circa 13th century. So it must really have been one of the greatest hits of its times. And then we see around the 15th, 16th centuries, there's a kind of explosion of translations in Kannada, Marathi, Gujarati, Assamese. So the Persian translation of the Mahabharata commissioned by Akbar, the Rezum-nama, it includes elements, so in the chapter, in the Ashwamedhika Parvan, it doesn't use the version from Vyasa's Mahabharata, but uses Jaimini's Ashwamedhika Parvan. So that's another indication of its popularity. You can find a very good kind of summary of the Jaimini Bharata and its Bhasha retellings in Sohini Sarapillai's excellent brand new book on the Mahabharata and its regional retellings. So what's the frame story? As the name suggests, Jaiminiya Ashwamedhika Parvan. This book, Jaimini's book, it has the story of a horse sacrifice, Ashwamedha, as its context and frame story. So the events are set after the great battle of the Mahabharata epic. Yudhishthira is ridden with guilt because of this large-scale massacre that he participated in. He wants to do something in atonement, and so the author come ancestor Vyasa comes and gives him a suggestion. He says, oh, you want to atone for killing all these relatives, why don't you kill a horse? So he suggests that you perform a horse sacrifice. Yudhishthira is diffident about doing something as big as this, but Vyasa convinces him that with Krishna's help, the whole thing will be successful. And then the horse is sent out on this kind of trip. And one of Yudhishthira's brothers, Arjuna or Bhima, will go turn by turn, accompanying the ritual horse as it goes from kingdom to kingdom. The condition of the Ashwamedha is that the rulers of each of these kingdoms must either accept that Yudhishthira is their sovereign, or they must tie up the horse if they want to challenge him. Most kings, out of fear and respect, and there are not many kings surviving, remember this is after the Mahabharata war, would accept Yudhishthira as their overlord, but there would be some upstart, confident ones who would challenge his authority and tie up the horse. Now each subplot within the Jaimini cycle is usually the story of one such intrepid ruler that challenges the authority of the Pandava emperor. As it turns out, all these challengers are bhaktas. They're all devotees of Vishnu Krishna, and they are usually able to defeat Arjuna, or in some cases Bhima, until whichever Pandava it is remembers that, oh, we need Krishna, and appeals to Krishna for help. And now with Krishna's help, this whichever Pandava is able to overcome the challenger, and then they say, okay, I'll accept Yudhishthira as my overlord. And this challenger turned ally joins the Pandava entourage and sets out to the next kingdom, following the horse. Now, scholars who worked on the Jaimini Bharata, there's not a lot of them, but they're very good scholars, Sohini Sarapillai, whom I mentioned, and Koski Kallio, they interpret this anthology of tales as being a kind of Vaishnava or Bhāgavata text, which is, one of them says, unabashedly apologetic and glorifying Vishnu. Yeah, partly right, but I read it a bit differently, and I think it's a text that actually highlights the agency and the potency of the devotee, of the bhakta, sometimes even at the expense of the deity, as my story will show you in a moment. So this celebration of fierce devotion and fierce devotees, what in Tamil is called one bhakti, Veera Bhakti, is kind of a singular feature of this Jaimini cycle. I'm mostly going to be using a Kannada retelling of the Jaimini Bharata. This is by a poet called Lakshmisha, circa 1500, 1550. Elena Mucciarelli, who's sitting in the back there, and we have an article on this text on the very episode that I'm going to tell you. So this talk is as much hers as it's mine. Also, Yigal and I have briefly written about the importance of the Lakshmisha's Jaimini Bharata in Kannada lit history. The Kannada Jaimini Bharata is almost twice the size of the Sanskrit source. It's far more polished and sophisticated. The Sanskrit source, its text is kind of written in this kind of workman-like Purana style, whereas the Kannada one is sophisticated. It's in the Mahakāvya style, in the very musical Shatpadi meter. Okay, so the hero of our story is a king called Mayuradhwaja. He So all the kings that appear in this cluster of stories, with the exception of the stories of Nala and Lava and Kusha, which we know from before, are names we've never heard before. And all their kingdoms are kingdoms whose names are not seen before in the Mahabharata. So clearly there's this kind of programmatic design. So one such weird story in the Jaimini cycle is the story of this devout king Mayuradhwaja, who's a Vaishnava Humpty Dumpty. When Arjuna and Krishna reach his capital, the city of Ratnanagara, their horse, meaning the Ashwamedha horse, gets into fight with another horse, a horse that belongs to King Mayuradhwaja. Now the prince, Mayuradhwaja's son, who's guarding his father's sacrificial horse, fights with Arjuna and Krishna, and after a long battle, the Pandava side is actually defeated. And Prince Tamradhwaja, that's Mayuradhwaja's son, he reports the victory to his father, hoping that he'll get a pat on the back. However, Mayuradhwaja is horrified at his son's misplaced priorities. And this kind of a pattern that runs throughout the story, even throughout the text. We see a dilemma, in the literal sense of the word, a fork in the road. When you could have done this, you do this other thing. So Mayuradhwaja really berates his son for driving away Krishna, the supreme god, for the sake of an empty ritual such as sacrifice. And then Krishna and Arjuna kind of retreat to plan their next strategy. Krishna's largest scheme, of course, is to teach Arjuna a lesson in modesty and a lesson in bhakti through the example of this devout king, Mayuradhwaja. So Krishna is going to subject King Mayuradhwaja to a bizarre and extreme ordeal to make this point. So let's take a couple of verses. This is when Mayuradhwaja is scolding his son's bad judgment. Akatakedisidanala karyamum namagide take yajnamindu namagi magam pageyalte swakarasthanada hariyam vittu kattidan gardhabhakriti hariyanu vikalamatiyagirtan idane velvenu utsukadinda modagudi manchadul prananayaka niral maredoragida adhamanganeyavol yendavanipan visusuidanu. So the verse goes, damn, my son has dashed my hopes. What's the use of this sacrifice now? He's not a son, he's an enemy. Maganalla pagayalte. And what did he do? Swakarasthanada hariyam vittu kattidan gardhabhakriti hariyam. He had Hari, Krishna, in the palm of his hand, and he let him go away. And meanwhile, he tied up this Hari, because Hari is also a synonym for horse, this Hari that's in the shape of an ass. And I apologize for this image, but he says, and he gives another upama, as if this weren't enough. He says, this is such poor judgment. It's like the lady, when the love of her life came to bed, she chose sleep over sex. This fellow is just like that. The king was fuming. So then he scolds the son a bit more, and there's another image where he says, how could you do this? It's like you were given a garland of tulasi and lotus, and instead you picked a garland of dhatura. Now, this is not innocuous, because dhatura is, of course, a weed, but also the dhatura has strong Shaiva associations. So in the story we find there's also this kind of subtext. And he scolds him again, saying, hey, you brought these little colts instead of bringing Krishna and Arjuna. Tell me where they are. So meanwhile, while all of this drama is happening, Krishna decides to teach Arjuna a lesson in bhakti. So he comes up with this plan where he's going to demand a sacrifice from the king Mayuradhwaja. But the gift he's going to ask is not the gift of an animal or of gold or some such everyday gift that you can ask from a king. So Krishna concocts this story. He disguises himself as a Brahmin. Arjuna is his young apprentice. He comes to the court of Mayuradhwaja and has this kind of tearjerker story. So supposedly this Brahmin son apprentice were coming through the forest leading to Mayuradhwaja's kingdom. They were waylaid by a lion which grabbed the son. The Brahmin appeals to the lion saying, hey, my son is young, you can take me, you can eat me, why don't you let him go? And he says, no, I'm hungry, and I don't want to eat your old bones, I'd like to eat a youthful body. So maybe if you go and get the king Mayuradhwaja, if you get me half of his body, that'll do, then I'll let your son go. So the Brahman comes and he seems very embarrassed, and he appeals to the king that, hey, listen, if you give me half of your body willingly, no pressure, then my son's going to be released. Now all of Mayuradhwaja's courtiers are horrified and they protest the claim. The king agrees without any demur. He prepares himself for this sacrifice. Meanwhile, the king Mayuradhwaja's wife Kumudavati and his son Tamradhwaja, they too are shocked, but they decide to take a different tack. They see that this Brahman is like a scholar, so they feel like we must speak his language, so let's use some Dharma Shastra and find some loophole, find some exception to escape this condition. So we have a nice verse from a very eloquent queen. I'm going to read you now the verse. Neem tilidudillarasa. It's not what you thought, king. Viprendran Aryan. Also this Brahmin didn't quite get it right. Vanantaradul asimham yandanudi. So what that lion, asimham, told in the forest, neither of you got it right. You didn't understand what it asked for. Also this poor Brahmin is just too harried because his son is taken. Let me tell you what it was. So, Shastra Siddhantam, let me explain to you what he said. Angane Purushan Ardhangam. So the wife is half of the man's body. So what he was asking for is that you give me. And what is all this madness, all this crazy talk about slashing your body in half? Don't do all that nonsense. Instead, you give me away living and breathing. And of course she says, I'll be happy because I can die as an aide. Now an aide is a term that I think in Tamil they would call Sumangali. I'll have the fortune of dying while I'm not yet a widow, and the tiger will be happy, and it's good for the kingdom. This is what she says. But Krishna is clever. He says, you're absolutely right. Of course, this is what the Dharma Shastra says. The wife is, of course, she's half of the man's body. You're totally right. However, the lion said he wants the king's right half, whereas the wife is the left half of the body. And the prince tries something similar. He says, oh, the Upanishad says, Atma vai putra namasi. The son is the father reborn. You can take me and so on. And he says, yes, of course, you're absolutely right, Prince Tamradhwaja. But you know what the tiger said? It said that the wife and the son must each hold the two ends of the hacksaw and saw the king Mayuradhwaja in half, and then I should take him the body. So, this can't do. None of these substitutes will work. So all of this sophistry of the queen and the prince are kind of in vain. The pseudo-Brahmin's trick works, and King Mayuradhwaja agrees to this macabre request and all of its strange conditions. So he has to give the right half of his body, he has to do this willingly, he has to do this without shedding a tear or crying out in pain. Finally, his wife and son have to personally saw him into two. And I have a couple of pictures that I can show you afterwards. And so this kind of very dramatic scene begins, and the wife and son start kind of hacking him in half. Meanwhile, a tear flows down Mayuradhwaja's left cheek from his left eye. And then the Brahmin immediately says, you seem to be unwilling for the sacrifice. It seems like these are tears of grief, so it's okay, I'm going to go away. I don't want to force you. Meanwhile, Mayuradhwaja, whose head has already been kind of cut in half, he asks his wife to put the two halves together so that he can speak. And he explains why his left eye welled up with tears. The explanation is kind of bland and sanctimonious. He says, my left eye is shedding tears because the left half of my body will go unused, whereas the right half is going through such a noble task. So this display of generosity is supposed to move all audiences. Arjuna, who's there, who's getting a lesson in humility, and whoever else was in the sabha there, and also diachronically, all the subsequent generations of readers and listeners like us. So in a way, this is kind of the grand finale, because Mayuradhwaja's devotion has been subjected to this acid test. and he's proven worthy. So now Krishna will kind of reveal himself, and so it didn't take all the king's horses to put Humpty Dumpty together again. It just needed Krishna, and he does put him together again. And then he says, you know what? I'm very pleased with your devotion, Mayuradhwaja. You can have your horse. He already has his horse. You also take Yudhishthira's horse. And you do not just not one, but 2 Ashwamedhas. And I'll help you and I'll preside over it and make sure things go well. And then Mayuradhwaja says, I can read your verse. Vishveshaninna shashvata murtiyam tadeva Vishwasadinde inagoppisidanigal ಈ ನಶ್ವರ ಶರೀರಮಂ ಸಾಕದಂತಿರಲು ಇಂತಾಂ ಕರ್ಮ ಕರ್ತೃವಾಗಿ ಅಶ್ವಮೇಧಂಗಳಂ ಮಾಡಿದೊಡೆನಗೆ ಅವನಿ ಉಚ್ಛ್ವಾಸದಿಂದೊಗೆದ ಮಂತ್ರಾಳಿಗಳ ಮಾತರಿಶ್ವಮಿತ್ರ ಜ್ವಾಲೆ ಪೊರೆಯೊಳಿರೆ ಭೇಷಜವನ್ ಅರಸುವರೆ ಹಿಮಕೆಂದನು. He says, Krishna, with the belief that I'll attain your eternal form, your Shashvata form, I've now submitted my, worldly body to you, my Nashvara Sharira. And I've had enough of it. Now if I were to perform these Ashwamedhas, when I have you in front of me, your Ushwasa, your in-breaths and out-breaths are the Veda, it would be like somebody who has a blazing fire in their hand looking for a remedy for a cold. I don't need it anymore. As you see, he rejects all the king's horses. And then Mayuradhwaja says, hey, listen, all I wanted was you, and we're all at your service. And I think there's something, of course, Arjuna learns his lesson, it's all happily ever after. That's kind of the end of the story. But there's something very special here, I think, in the episode of the split head. And Heston has written about this, about the head being split in the context of sacrifice. And this idea may be like some mandapas being reappropriated in a bhakti world, which is to say that the loving, feeling body is much more central as the agent and instrument of bhakti, rather than the purely meditating intellectual head. And the tribute that Krishna demands through the pseudo-Brahmin with the fake news about the tiger is precisely this, the splitting of the head. In some sense, the head is kind of really being split, it's being rewired and put back together, because the conventional modes of cognition, which are mostly about the brain, have been taken over to formulate new modes of understanding, a mode where it's about feeling over argument. And I think that's the story of the Mayuradhwaja in the Jaimini Bharata. Now, by itself, the text has many other fascinating elements. There are later stories where Arjuna goes to the kingdom of the Amazons. He goes to the Stri Rajya, or Alli Rajyam in Tamil. And I recently discovered with my partner Sara that this kind of draws from the Alexander romances. And it's amazing to think about bits from the Alexander romances being transplanted into a Sanskrit source from the 12th century. And this was the story I wanted to share with all of you. I'll show you a couple of pictures. You might have seen them, and they're prevalent in popular culture, but you just may not know that it's from the Tamradhwaja story. So the Tamradhwaja Mayuradhwaja story is also very popular in the particularly lurid Nautanki form that we see in Haryana, where I currently live. The story's changed a bit there. It's the prince whose head has to be split in half, not the father. And they do it in this kind of popular theatre form in Haryana and Rajasthan, where you can see mother and father slicing through the head of the son, and they have fake blood pouring down the sides, and it's very visual, very graphic. It's all right if you can't do it. It's fine. And there's also a popular oleograph print that Ravi Verma brought out from his press, of which the sign of its success is proven by the fact that there was also a piracy of the same image. Now this is a Ravi Verma oleograph. You may have seen it before. I think some people, they have this at home and they're not quite sure what it is, and they decide it's a picture of Satyanarayana and they use it for Satyanarayana worship. But that's King Mayuradhwaja with his son and his wife holding the two ends of this hacksaw, cutting him in half, and Krishna appears in his true form as Vishnu, while also next to him is Krishna as the pseudo-Brahmin, and behind him is Arjuna looking very skeptical at the whole scene. Now, this, I apologize for the quality of the picture. This is in the Jaipur Palace Museum. This is from one of the Rezamnama paintings, and it's important because we don't know at what stage they chose Jaimini's account of the Ashwamedhika Parva and inserted it into Vyasa's account while retelling it in Persian. Clearly, this is the more spicy, more interesting version of the Ashwamedha chapter. And I don't know how much you can see, but there's the king over there getting a brain surgery from his wife and son. And this picture is clearly a kind of epigone of the Ravi Verma painting. It's from 4 years after by another press in Bombay, and it clearly is imitating that one. Yes, I just wanted to show you a couple of these. I may have another, these are all the pictures I have. Okay, so yes, that was the story I had to tell you from the Jaimini Ashwamedhika Parva.
So I have a technical question about the story, then the other things I'd like you to tell us maybe a little more about Lakshmisha and the cultural environment in which she produced this thing. But I'm wondering if Mayuradhwaja, in the course of the operation that he's undergoing, or after it, is able to think. Does he have thoughts and language and things like that?
He's aware all the time, and that's kind of interesting because it's true. When you can have brain surgery without anesthesia, you don't have nerves inside your brain, and I'm sure that Shmisha somehow knew that. But he's mindful. It's not like he's gone unconscious, so he's awake. But I presume he must also have thoughts. But there's a very beautiful description about how he prepared himself. It almost sounds like how you would, I don't know, marinate a kebab. So he goes and bathes in Ganga water, and he applies tulasi, and he sips the water in which the salagrama is bathed. So he's kind of preparing himself for the sacrifice. But I do think there's something very powerful in the way that the whole story has been laid out, because it's I didn't say enough about this, but it's perhaps the first time that we see the appearance of these forms of militant bhakti in a Vaishnava context. We know the stories of, so David wrote about the hungry god was it with Appar? Sundaram. And there are these accounts of, say, Siriyalan or Sirutonda Nayana, the story of Kannappan, who did a similar surgery on himself. And these are from a little bit earlier than, I think, stories like Mayuradhwaja start appearing, and I feel we have to see the emergence of this new thread of stories in the Vaishnava world. Vaishnavas can be plenty violent, but it's usually towards somebody else. But directing violence towards yourself or your own as an expression of your devotion, we feel, Helena and I, that it first makes its appearance in the Jaimini Bharata. And this also demonstrates how kind of sectarian responses to each other can be seen at many levels. Sometimes it's in the form of imitating iconographic or architectural elements. Sometimes the most obvious form is in writing doctrinal texts where you criticize each other. And sometimes it can be in writing stories that kind of mirror and are intertexts of each other. And I feel that's something we see, not just in this story, in a whole bunch. So in the same book, there's another guy who's the Samosa Bhakta, he demonstrates his bhakta by jumping into a cauldron of hot oil. So Sudhanva, the story of Sudhanva. And there's a whole series of stories in the Jaimini Bharata of these devotees who, yeah, but I realize I'm not answering your question about Tamrathaja's mind. But yeah, this was something I meant to say, that we see a slew of stories of people who demonstrate that if there's violence from a higher power like God, you cannot respond to it with intellect. And the only way to neutralize that violence is kind of the only violence that supersedes it is this kind of submission. Submission is what can neutralize that violence. And maybe that's a Vaishnava model of the one bhakti and one nandu that we see in Jainism and in the tribal sources. Lakshmisha, oh yes. So it's a fantastic kāvya. It's after Mallinatha. It's full of many delightful puns and shleshas that are not just repeating available shlesha templates from Sanskrit. There are many new shleshas that are only possible in a Dravidian language. And he's a very sophisticated poet. I think there's a bad translation from the previous millennium, 1913, Anderson, and it's a partial translation, and it's a difficult book to translate, but it's a great poem. And he was in a kind of Vijayanagambilyo. He doesn't name any patron. He lived somewhere near Chikmagalur, and he also wrote some songs. But he was a very accomplished poet, and it's kind of one of the two most popular books. So we have the older, more prestigious Jaina retellings of the Mahabharata by Pampa and Ranna. But you wouldn't find too many people, say, average educated people in the 19th century in Karnataka who remember many verses from those texts. But from the Jaimini Bharata, you would find, and this is across sectarian groups, whether it's a Virashaiva or a Jaina or a Hindu, they would all know 40 or 50 verses from the Jaimini Bharata. The Jaimini Bharata was also productive in that each of these episodes, which are kind of modular, have been converted into super hits in the Yakshagana stage. So there's a Tamrathaja episode, Yakshagana, there's a Babhruvahana episode, Yakshagana, which was also made into a movie, and so on. And each of these, if you look at them, they have Shatpadis from Lakshmisa's text inset as verses in the Yakshagana. So it shows you how deeply kind of percolated into literary and theatrical culture of the times and several centuries afterwards. Yes, Professor Keshav.
I have a question which is not quite related to this particular video. We hear that when the different versions of Mahabharata were put to rest, finally the Vaishampayana version was accepted as authentic, and Vyasa himself authorizing the Vaishampayana version and particularly rejecting the Jaimini version. But later at some point in time, about 13th century or so, when Lakshmisha knew, we see this coming back only in one part of India, that is Karnataka, from where it spread to northern India. What could be the reason? Was there a kind of a descent to the authorized version, and the context in which this descent was articulated? I was wondering whether this could be inquired into.
It's a great question. I think we have to think about it together, especially the bit about is it reflecting something from the times. But let me hasten to clarify that it's in Kannada, especially, it's called the Jaimini Bharata, but it doesn't have the story of the whole Mahabharata, and it's very specific. It's the account of this so-called Ashwamedha Yajna and the aftermath of that, and these little adventures to various kingdoms. And I'm not entirely sure. We'd have to map it out if the other regional versions were kind of channeled through the Kannada retelling. Somehow I feel that, I do think that also the Sanskrit Jaimini Bharata was produced in South India. This description of you know, taking Tulasi and Salagrama Toya, it is much more closely aligned to southern practices or older southern practices of Vaishnavism. But somehow I feel there must have been something in the air in the 15th, 16th centuries all over, and it must have been also the historical and political circumstances that made this story make sense. Because we see in Gujarat, we see in Assam, within a very short time of Lakshmi Chand, I don't think they had, Gujarat and Karnataka kind of had connections, but it would have been wonderful, but I don't think there were many bilingual Assamese, Kannadiga court poets for this to happen through a direct line of transmission. But these clusters of stories, it must have, and we find that even a little bit later after this, when they were putting together anthologies of ideal bhaktas. So in Maharashtra, they have this Bhaktamala. So along with these old ones like Prahlada, Ambarish, and so on, we find a name like Mayurathwaja. Nobody else from this cluster, but Mayurathwaja. So he's kind of making it to the Hall of Fame, to the Vaishnava Hall of Fame. But what do you think? Do you think that this description of how you go conquer a king and then make them your ally and then move on to the next kingdom and conquer them, do you think that resonates with goings on in the 16th century? Do you think that it's kind of a weak claim, but do you think this is what may have made it appeal to people at this time? We can talk about it afterwards. Okay, thank you all then. Thanks for the opportunity.